Hello! This unit discusses the central ideas about the origin of language. We will look at the development of man, we will deal with the biological prerequisites for speech, and we'll discuss the main theories of language origin. As usual, start with a virtual session. If you want guidance, use the question sheet with its hyperlinks. At the end, you should be in a position to answer questions such as: could Homo erectus speak? Did Neanderthals have a language? How did language emerge? Well, and after the virtual session, tackle the mastery worksheet, a multiple choice test with 10 standard level and 10 advanced level questions. And on the practical sheet, you can solve several problems associated with the evolution of language and thus deepen your knowledge. So, good luck with this unit.
I welcome all users to this website on linguistics.
Kaç Stinavs. Daşu. Kitabın üzerinde.
Welcome all who come to use the linguistics website here.
Salvete omnes, qui his paginis inter retialibus linguisticis utamini.
Welcome to VLC 108 Language Typology, a course whose main goal is to deepen your understanding of the languages of the world, their structures, their central linguistic parameters from phonological to syntactic, and their underlying principles of language variation. The course automatically integrates a unique source of the Virtual Linguistics Campus, its language index. This collection of hundreds of languages and varieties with structured audio data serves to illustrate the linguistic properties of each language mentioned, including their geographical distribution and beyond. VLC 108 involves, among others, the discussion of language universals and linguistic change. To cope with these and other complex topics, it is recommended that you are familiar with several topics beforehand, most importantly with the main concepts of phonology, morphology, and syntax. If you aren't, we recommend to self-enroll to VLC 101 Linguistic Fundamentals, our introductory course to linguistics, where you can brush up your knowledge in these areas. This does not mean that you have to take this course before you tackle VLC 108. Our recommendation is to self-enroll to this and other VLC courses and to access the information if and when required. Let us now look at the content of VLC 108. If you have an account on the OER VLC website, which is of course free, accessing VLC 108 is simple. Just log in with your personal data and you will find the course in your course overview. A click on the bottom of the VLC 108 tile leads you to the repository start site, where you have access to all topics, starting with a preliminary section with advice and help on how to use VLC 108. The repository is subdivided into three central parts. A general part, where the main principles of language evolution and language comparison are introduced, for example, the comparative method or the principles of language reconstruction. Part 2 focuses on the central parameters of language classification, from phonological to syntactic, including a special treatment of case and the principles of case syncretism. The final part of VLC 108 widens the approach and deals with the main approaches towards language universals, the principles of language change, aspects of language contact, and the phenomenon of language disappearance, where we have to face the situation in which 3,000 or more languages that are still spoken are endangered. Two more specialized topics have been added at the end. One about the typological development of English and one about the evolution of writing from proto-writing to early writing until today's situation. This list of topics is being updated and quality assured on a regular basis. Furthermore, all parts are supported by dialect maps and multimedial material from the VLC Language Index and from special VLC 108 databases to make available sound and video data whenever required. And our teaching and learning concept? Well, as you know, studying online on the Virtual Linguistics campus means go through each unit at your own pace. Select a topic and tick off the activities you have worked through and make use of as many VLC options as possible. And if you don't know what to do first, use the How to Proceed options at the beginning of each unit. And as most of you know, each unit should be finished with a mastery test, where you can earn your personal VLC badges. Maybe you prefer using your mobile device. If so, feel free to download the Moodle app, log in and study where and whenever you want. Well, that's it. As usual, the rest is up to you. Thanks for your attention and see you on the Virtual Linguistics campus. Speculation about the origins of human language is as old as history. Although there is disagreement about the exact time, language, as we know it today, probably appeared relatively late in the prehistory of humans. We will look at two central aspects of language evolution in this e-lecture. First, we will discuss the biological prerequisites for human language, and then we will speculate a little bit and discuss the main hypotheses about the origin of human language. Let us start with the biological prerequisites. The evolution of human language is closely connected with changes in two organs essential for the use of language: the structure and the size of the human brain, and the shape of the vocal tract. Anthropologists have collected evidence that from about 2 million years before Christ onwards, Homo habilis and Homo erectus had developed a brain fit for basic linguistic tasks. And they discovered that with the advent of Homo sapiens at around 400,000 years before Christ, from Archaicus via Neanderthalensis to Homo sapiens himself, that Homo sapiens developed a vocal tract that gradually became ready for the use of some sort of speech. Let us look at these two prerequisites in more detail. The most important prerequisite for the production of language is a well-developed central nervous system with an elaborate cortex. While the Australopithecus cortex volume did not exceed 600 cubic centimeters, Homo sapiens exhibits an average brain volume of roughly 1,400 cubic centimeters. Here are the approximate figures. Now, Australopithecus brain, as we heard, has a volume of roughly 500 cubic centimeters. Habilis brain is larger, roughly 750 cubic centimeters. Homo erectus had a brain whose size was something like 900 cubic centimeters, and Homo archaicus, the first representative of Homo sapiens, increased this once more to 1,200 cubic centimeters, and Homo neanderthalensis brain was even larger with 1,500 cubic centimeters. However, brain size alone is not the key factor. The brain of Homo neanderthalensis was even larger than ours. Yet, well, you all might know what happened. Thus, we shouldn't solely examine the size, but rather the structure of the brain. And here, it is known that 3 brain centers are primarily responsible for the production and comprehension of speech. The first of these centers is referred to as Broca's area. It can be found in the front of the left hemisphere of the cortex, and it was named after the French physiologist Paul Broca, who lived in the 19th century. It is commonly known as the motor center for speech. According to recent insights, Broca's area is not a unit. Rather, it is responsible for several aspects such as word associations, ordering principles, speech output, to name a few. The second brain center is referred to as Wernicke's area, named after the German physiologist Karl Wernicke. It is commonly known as the sensory center for speech, that is primarily for the reception of speech. Last but not least, we have the gyrus angularis, which is a kind of switchboard for all sorts of neural impulse. For example, it establishes neural associations between the shape and the sound of objects. The investigation of hominid skulls has shown that as early as Homo habilis, who was around from 2.3 million years before Christ onwards, all these centers were relatively well developed. Thus, the brain of Homo habilis was ready for the cognitive foundations of some sort of language. The second prerequisite is a particularly shaped vocal tract. And this vocal tract must be in a position to produce a sufficiently large sound repertoire. This involves, apart from the lips that are involved in rounded versus unrounded vowels such as oo versus e, a special source of phonation. That is, we need the larynx with the vocal folds, and also we need a flexible resonance chamber that can amplify and modify the fundamental frequency created by the sound source in the larynx. Interestingly, the larynx and the size and shape of the oral cavity are closely connected. Let's look at this connection in more detail. Now here you see the vocal tract on the left-hand side and 2 views of the larynx, the anterior view and the side view. Now on top of the larynx we have a very interesting bone here in the 2 views, referred to as the hyoid bone. This horseshoe-shaped hyoid bone is linked to the tongue by means of a particular connection referred to as the hyoglossus. Let's illustrate this by moving this sort of larynx into the vocal tract. Now this would be roughly the larynx position, and here is the connection between the tongue and the larynx, the hyoid bone, the so-called hyoglossus. Here we are. The interesting effect is the following. a lower larynx position leads to a retraction of the tongue. And this is exactly what happened during evolution. The larynx of early representatives of Homo was relatively high, enabling him to breathe and eat simultaneously. The sound production capabilities, however, were restricted. During evolution, probably due to the increasingly erect position, the human larynx descended into the throat. Leading to a separation of uvula and epiglottis. This in turn has the consequence that the human vocal tract is now subdivided into two chambers responsible for the essential formant frequencies. Now, the low larynx position has led to these two resonance chambers. And now with this lower larynx position and a vocal tract which is clearly subdivided into an oral cavity and into a pharyngeal cavity, Homo sapiens can produce a wide range of speech sounds. Now, with the advent of Homo sapiens at around 400,000 years before Christ, the vocal tract gradually became ready for the use of some sort of speech with a relatively large sound repertoire. But why did language emerge? Well, this leads us to the discussion of hypotheses of language origin. That the predecessors of Homo sapiens were capable of using some sort of communication system is undisputed. How then could we explain the constant growth of the brain from Homo habilis to Homo sapiens? However, the initial impetus for the use of language is unclear. Ignoring these theological claims of language origin represented by these pictures, there are several modern hypotheses about the emergence of language. One of them is referred to as the gestural hypothesis. Even though there are no apes in the ancestral line of Homo sapiens, the discovery that apes can learn to communicate by means of gestures constitutes the basis of the gestural hypothesis of language origin. This scenario is obvious. Once Homo stood erect, he had his hands free for complex social interactions. The problem is explaining how and why and when gestures gave way to vocal signals of communication. One proposal is that tongue movements accompanied hand gestures. Whenever we have to perform complex tasks, our tongue supports our hands. For example, if young children write, their tongue often goes like this. Or if you have to thread something through a needle's eye, you go. Well, is this evidence for a relationship between tongue flexibility and language emergence? We may speculate. The vocalization hypothesis suggests that language evolved from a relatively small set of instinctively used discrete calls shared by all hominids. They could have sounded like that. Well, whether it was really like that, you may speculate again. But such a hypothesis might explain why all languages of the world are still so much alike in terms of their sound repertoire. However, before any significant precursor to real language came into being, our ancestors had to become capable, perhaps by means of sudden genetic mutation, of combining vocal signs in sequences having indefinitely different meanings. And thereafter our ancestors, who had shared millions of years of common evolutionary changes, rapidly dispersed over our planet, beginning racial and linguistic diversification. The neural hypothesis holds that language resulted from a gradual increase in general intelligence, documented by an increase in brain volume, as we saw earlier on, and thus an increase in the precision of the wiring of the neural network. An interesting hypothesis of how modern language could have emerged is referred to as the mother-child interaction hypothesis. Language could have evolved through time as a consequence of the interaction between the immature newborn baby and its mother. The newborn infant, unlike any other mammal, is highly immature and has to be looked after all the time. When hominids started walking on two legs, it became more and more difficult for them to look after their babies. Increasing mobility required that adults, primarily the mothers, had to take their babies with them. At first, this was relatively easy, the babies simply holding on to their mother's fur. However, with a gradual loss of fur and nothing to hold on to, the young ones had to be carried, preferably on their left arm, as this picture here illustrates. It may be that during those many occasions when it was being carried, the baby first used vegetative sounds like burping, crying, then comfort cries, and eventually some sort of babbling like mum, 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 and its mother reacted. Such phases can today be observed during the early periods of language acquisition. Well, let's summarize. The development of language was not a matter of sudden changes, but rather a continuous development over millions of years. The phases of this development can still be seen in many features of modern language behavior: gestures, facial expressions, primitive crying and shouting, babbling, and intonation are steps towards real language. Initial traces of language could thus have appeared as early as Australopithecus, or even earlier. Homo habilis and Homo erectus were even more likely to have used language already. They left behind stone tools that suggest some degree of acquired technology. Some sort of language can be assumed to have contributed to this level of technical sophistication. Homo sapiens appeared at around 400,000 years before Christ, and it is extremely difficult to believe that he lacked language. His brain was certainly large and complex enough, and his vocal tract was ready for speech. From 2 million years before Christ onwards, man gradually became ready for the use of language. However, with no evidence available, the structure of the first language will perhaps never be known. Yet, by a method of language comparison, former systems of human communication, so-called proto-languages, can be reconstructed. The underlying principles of language reconstruction constitute the focus of this e-lecture. In particular, we will discuss the following issues. What exactly is a proto-language? And how can we compare languages? And last but not least, what sort of linguistic data can be used for the comparative method? Let's start with proto-languages. A proto-language is a hypothetical or reconstructed, typically extinct language. It is not known directly, rather it is a linguistic reconstruction that is formulated by applying the comparative method. A well-known example is Indo-European, or to be precise, Proto-Indo-European. This is the reconstructed common ancestor of the Indo-European languages. It comprises most European and about 1/3 of all languages, and is assumed to have been spoken in Central Europe and in South Asia between 6,000 and 4,000 years before Christ. The Indo-Europeans probably lived in Central Europe before they began to travel east and west between 3,500 and 2,500 before Christ. It was reconstructed by August Schleicher, who you can see over here, who published his results in his monumental work, A Compendium of the Comparative Grammar of the Indo-European Languages. Other reconstructed languages are, for example, Proto-Afroasiatic, Proto-Dravidian, Proto-Altaic, and Proto-Eskimo-Aleut. Some linguists, among them, for example, Joseph Greenberg, and a number of Russian linguists, discerned similarities among these proto-languages, such as Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic and the others, and postulated a common ancestor to all these languages, which he called Nostratic. The Nostratic hunter-gatherers would have occupied all of Europe, Northern Africa, and large parts of Asia from an origin in the Middle East, perhaps around 15,000 years before Christ. Yet, all this is still very speculative. Well, and the story can even be extended, presupposing a monogenetic view of language origin, that is, a hypothesis that all languages have a common origin. The earliest proto-languages could have a common ancestor. Well, according to Merritt Ruhlen, a well-known typologist, it could be called Proto-Sapiens. You might also want to use the term proto-human, proto-world, proto-terrestric, to name a few. But this is all very, very speculative. So let us now look at the principles of reconstructing such proto-languages in more detail. In the 18th century, scholars began to compare groups of languages in a systematic way, to see whether there were any correspondences between them. Evidence of a common origin for groups of languages was readily available in Europe, and by the beginning of the 19th century the hypothesis emerged that there was once a language from which the many languages of Eurasia derived. As already mentioned, this proto-language came to be called Indo-European, or to be absolutely precise, Proto-Indo-European. The standard way of reconstructing such ancestor languages is referred to as the comparative method. Now, the comparative method is a way of systematically comparing a series of languages in order to show a historical relationship between them. Scholars begin by identifying a set of formal similarities and differences between the languages, thus trying to reconstruct an earlier stage from which all forms could have derived. Let us look at the word or the phrase "the book" in the Romance languages in order to illustrate the comparative method. Now, you all know that in Spanish we would say el libro. In French it is le livre. In Italian we have il libro. And in Portuguese, o livro is the equivalence of the book. In looking at the word book, we can find amazing similarities. All these forms start with a lateral consonant, L. Then we have an unrounded high front vowel, E, which in some languages may be lengthened, in others it is short. The next segment is either a voiced alveolar plosive or some sort of labiodental fricative, so we have this sort of variation. And then we have some sort of R, which can either be alveolar or even uvular or velar. Well, and then in some of these languages we have a vowel. So let's represent it like this. If Latin, the common ancestor language to these Romance languages, no longer existed, it would thus be possible to reconstruct a proto-word such as liber or livre, perhaps with a schwa between lib and r, in order to ease the articulation of the word. And that sort of proto-word would be very close to the real word in Latin, which is of course liber. Exactly this reasoning is used for cases where the parent language no longer exists. For example, when the forms in Greek and Sanskrit, former classical languages, are compared in order to reconstruct the Indo-European proto-word. Such words, by the way, are often marked with an initial asterisk. This principle, which we have just applied, is referred to as cognate comparison. This method was introduced in the 19th century by the neo-grammarians, a group of German philologists at the University of Leipzig. So let's look at cognate comparison in more detail. Central to this method is the comparison of cognates, that is, words from different languages with a similar orthographical and phonological shape denoting the same thing. Numbers are very good in this respect. So let's once more illustrate this principle, this time supported by audio evidence from the language index on the Virtual Linguistics campus, and I will now load the cognate comparison component of the language index. Here we are. So let's simply first of all listen to the number 3 in the following languages. Let's start with Spanish.
3,
The next one is English.
3,
Let's move on to German.
3,
Now here is Polish.
3,
Czech.
3,
And finally, let's take Ukrainian.
3,
Now what have we found? In Spanish we have tres. In English, 3. The German word for 3 was drei. In Czech we have, well, somewhere here, trzy. In Polish, trzy. And finally we heard Ukrainian 3. Now in looking at these words we see amazing parallels. Some languages have an alveolar plosive in the initial position, others have an affricate like Czech or Polish, or a fricative as in English. The next segment is in many languages some sort of R again, which can be an approximant, a trill, or a fricative. And then all languages have one vowel, which is some sort of high front vowel. So the similarities are amazing. So in such a list of cognates, systematic phonological correspondences emerge. They imply that these languages are genetically related. The evaluation of such correspondences allows the reconstruction of earlier phonological stages and eventually the sound system of a now extinct ancestor language, in this case Indo-European. The proto-word for 3, by the way, has been reconstructed as something like trace, and in order to signal that this is a proto-word, let's put an asterisk in front of it. Trace. Using this method of cognate comparison, the main philologists of the 19th century, in particular the neo-grammarians, established principled relationships between the languages spoken in Europe. And then there was someone called Jacob Grimm, generally known as the author of fairy tales, but of course he's also known as a linguist. And he discovered some principled relationships between the classical languages Sanskrit, Greek and Latin on the one hand, and the Germanic languages on the other. Let's look at his discovery in more detail. In taking the word for father, we will find the following words. In Sanskrit you would say piter, in classical Greek you would say pater, in Latin it would be pater, and in English of course father. This of course is British English. Now if we look at the initial elements, we have in the classical languages a bilabial plosive and in English a labiodental fricative. So this is what we have. And if we inspect further data, we can generalize this sort of relationship to the following. If we have an initial voiceless plosive in one of the classical languages, we will get a fricative in with the same place of articulation or a similar place of articulation in the Germanic languages. This is just one observation. Here is another one. Now let's look at the word for brother in these languages. In Sanskrit it would be something like vrater, in classical Greek frater, frater, sorry. In Latin it would be frater, and in English we get of course brother. And again, if we look just at the initial segments, you will find that we have some sort of fricative in the classical languages and a bilabial plosive in English and also in the other Germanic languages. So we could generalize this as a sort of rule. Some sort of affricated bilabial element, plosive or fricative, comes out as a bilabial plosive in the Germanic languages, and here is the generalization. So this observation with further generalizations has become known as Grimm's law, or the first consonantal shift. And as I said earlier on, it goes back to Jacob Grimm. Jacob Grimm is of course this one here on our picture, together with his brother, and this first consonantal shift that distinguishes Germanic on the one hand from the classical languages, Indo-European languages on the other, has been known as Grimm's law, or as I said, the first consonantal shift. Now this sort of cognate comparison can even be more complex. Now if we compare some languages, like for example from top to bottom, English, Dutch, Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic and German, and we look at the cognates in it, for example we could look at the representation of the verb give, which is marked in red here, or we could look at the cognate bread, brood, bröd, bröd, braus, brot in these languages. Well, then we see amazing similarities, and in fact all these languages are Germanic languages. However, we could even say more. We could now say something about word order principles. Here we have imperative sentences, and obviously all these languages have the verb in the initial position. In German the word order is slightly deviant, but it is also possible, but normally the verb is also in the initial position. Or can we make statements about morphological complexity? Well, if we look at these languages and look at the word for daily, for example, we have an adverb. We have an adverb here. Here, and you see the different representation of adverbs plus some morphological element to be added, illustrate the degrees of morphological complexity of these languages. So in comparing existing with extinct languages, or comparing them with other existing languages with each other, mind-boggling parallels emerge. They can best be explained by assuming principled relationships between them. So, that humans could speak a long time ago is undisputed. Yet, the exact structure of their early communication systems will probably never be revealed. However, and I hope to have shown this in this e-lecture, the principles of language comparison allow us to reconstruct former languages without having written, let alone spoken evidence. Using this comparative method, we can reconstruct proto-languages such as, for example, Indo-European or Proto-Altaic. According to some linguists, we can even go further back and postulate a common ancestor language to all of these. We found out that Nostratic could be a suitable name, and even further back, Nostratic could be grouped with other reconstructed proto-languages. Eventually then we could find a first language spoken on our planet, well, proto-world, proto-sapiens, proto-human, or whatever name we would like to find for it. However, I hope to have shown that this involves a high degree of speculation.